Not at all. 2 weeks later, return to Kiel, October 4th, 1968. Now Cowboy Bill Watts, who's been winning on TV, winning at the Kiel, gets his championship match against Gene Kiniski, 2 out of 3 falls.
And this is an interesting night in wrestling in St. Louis. A lot of stories come out of this particular card. In particular, we'll talk about Gene Kiniski and Cowboy Bill Watts. Kiniski winning 2 out of 3 falls. The third fall coming when Watts tries a giant splash. Kiniski brings his knees up. Watts crashes into the knees. He's all gassed up, bent double. Kiniski rolls on top of him, gets the pin of 3. However, I heard 2 stories, and I heard one story and I read another story about this finish. Pat O'Connor told me the story about the finish from his perspective. He said that this, and this was Pat being helpful to me. I mean, he was explaining the politics, the personality of putting in a finish with headstrong people, and certainly Bill Watts was one, and Gene Kiniski was the world champion. Pat said, I put in a finish, I wanted him to use the reverse rolling cradle, the O'Connor roll-up that he used. He says, where Watts would try the reverse rolling cradle, he'd nearly get a pin once. He'd try it a second time, and they'd run him into the turnbuckle. Kiniski would duck his head, so Watts would run into the turnbuckle, and he'd fall back, and then Kiniski cover. He says, and they both sat and they looked at me. I looked at them, and finally Kiniski said, it's a hell of a finish, Pat. There's only one problem. Neither of us can do it. We're not. If Watts can't do a reverse rolling cradle, look at him. He's a bull, and he was. He was just a powerhouse at the time. That finish won't work. And then O'Connor kind of, he realized, and as he was telling me, he said, you always have to, when you put in a finish, you have to take into account the physical capabilities of those who are wrestling. Now, currently, in the year 2010, late in 2010, going into 2011, those finishes may not matter. They don't even look necessarily at the athleticism a lot of times. They look at how many people they can run in and how many referees they can bump before they get a pin. And quite often, it's not based on the abilities. There's a different way to do finishes, and it doesn't necessarily involve what the guys in the ring can do to the best of their ability. That's been, generally speaking, I think, something that's hurt wrestling a little bit. I mean, in UFC, which is clobbering WWE at this particular point in time when it comes to pay-per-view, we don't have referees or run-ins on the finishes. The guy who wins just is better at punching or a ground game or submissions or something than the guy he beat, at least on that given night. And the people accept it and they go on. They might still pay to see the guy who lost just as well if he has a good match. That's how wrestling was in those days, and that's what Kiniski and Watts eventually put together, that finish off the giant splash. In Bill Watts' book, I noticed that he claimed this was a problem in St. Louis because they came up with a finish where they wanted him carried out of the ring. Now, O'Connor never really talked about that specifically to me. He mentioned they talked about different finishes, and apparently one that was considered was that Watts would get hurt and be unable to continue in the third fall. And anybody who's been listening to these shows, certainly going through the 1960s, knows this is certainly not uncommon in St. Louis. It was done with Dick the Bruiser. It was done with Fritz von Erich. It was done with Kiniski himself. It was done with Dory Funk Jr. Watts claims that would have destroyed him. That was a terrible finish. He wouldn't do it. And they brought Lou Thez in, and Lou Thez told him he had to do this finish. Well, Thez was on the card. I doubt they brought Thez in on that. Maybe Thez did try to talk. Maybe Thez had to come in to restore some peace between Watts and Kiniski on this particular finish. But at the time, Lou Thez did not have 1 point, not 1%, half of 1% in the St. Louis Wrestling Club. He was a friend of Sam Muchnick's, obviously, and certainly had been the NWA champion for years, so I'm sure he may have been in there helping to negotiate through that finish. In the end, they got a pin. So what's the difference if he has a knee injury, a shoulder injury, and he can't continue, which, of course, Watts wanted to be portrayed as indestructible. That couldn't happen to him. It didn't matter. He got beat anyway, 2 out of 3 falls. So there obviously was a disagreement on that particular finish, which, and as I said, O'Connor very openly to me said it was his mistake on the first finish because it was something the two guys physically could not do to the best of their ability. There were other finishes you had to do with 300-pound Bill Watts and 275-pound Gene Kiniski, not the O'Connor roll-up.
Right.
Whether we wanted to do injury or not, well, Watts, of course, had no inkling of the history of St. Louis and didn't know that that happened now and then, and it was accepted because the business was over so strong in St. Louis. Fans accepted that there are injuries, and sometimes a guy gets hurt and he can't continue and he loses. But same finish, same result at the end in that Gene Kiniski defended the World Heavyweight title by winning 2 out of 3 falls from Cowboy Bill Watts.